There is a particular cruelty reserved for men who fight to prove their humanity in a country that has not yet decided to grant it. It is a cruelty that operates not with a fist or a rifle, but with silence, with the systematic withholding of acknowledgement, with the slow, methodical erasure of names from the ledger of national memory, names that were written there in blood, in mud, in the smoke of burning German armor across the hills of France and Belgium and Austria. On the 5th of November 1944, a convoy of Sherman tanks rolled through a French port. The men inside them had crossed the Atlantic in troopships, had endured the indignity of segregated berths on vessels carrying them to fight for freedoms they were legally denied at home. They had trained for 2 years under commanders who, in many cases, doubted they were capable of learning to fight at all. They had survived the institutional contempt of an army that could not decide whether they were soldiers or servants. And on that grey November morning, as their tanks ground through the mud of Normandy's autumn, they received a visitor. His name was George S. Patton. He was, by any measure, the most celebrated American combat general of the Second World War. Ferocious, theatrical, and utterly assured of his own mythology, he stood before 600 black men, and he gave a speech that has been quoted, misquoted, and selectively remembered ever since. What he said to them is part of the record. What happened to them afterward, what they achieved, what they were denied, and what was done to their memory in the decades that followed, that is the buried part. That is the story this channel exists to tell. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the unit that called itself the Black Panthers, served 183 consecutive days of combat in the European theater of operations. They fought in 7 major campaigns. They helped liberate at least 2 Nazi concentration camps. They were recommended for the Presidential Unit Citation before the war even ended, and then the recommendation was set aside. The citation was not awarded for 33 years. 33 years of silence, during which the men who survived returned home to a country that responded to their service with continued segregation, continued disenfranchisement, and in some documented cases, lethal violence. This is not a story that history forgot. History does not forget by accident. This is a story that was pushed below the surface, held under by the weight of a national mythology that could not accommodate the truth of what these men represented and what granting them their due would have required the country to admit about itself. We will not let it stay buried. To understand the 761st Tank Battalion, you must first understand the world that created it. And the world that created it was one of breathtaking contradiction. The United States that entered the Second World War in December of 1941 was a nation structured at every legal and institutional level around the premise of black inferiority. The Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy Firth, Ferguson had formalized the doctrine of separate but equal, a legal fiction so transparently dishonest that it required the entire machinery of state violence to maintain it. In the South, where the majority of African Americans still lived, the separation was total. Separate schools, separate hospitals, separate drinking fountains, separate courtrooms. And backing all of this up was the extra-legal terror of lynching, a practice so routine that the NAACP flew a flag outside its New York office reading "A man was lynched yesterday," each time a new name was added to the count. Between 1877 and 1950, that flag was raised more than 4,000 times. This was the country that, on December 8, 1941, asked its black citizens to die for it. The response from African American communities was complicated and significant. Many black leaders and publications, most famously the Pittsburgh Courier, launched the Double V campaign, a call for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The logic was clear-eyed and politically sophisticated. Participation in the war effort would be used as leverage for civil rights. Fighting fascism would expose the hypocrisy of American apartheid. The blood shed on European battlefields would be a down payment on democracy at home. Whether or not this calculation ultimately proved correct is a question historians still argue. What is undeniable is that roughly 1 million African Americans served in the United States Armed Forces during the Second World War. They served in a military that was entirely segregated by official policy, a policy encoded in Army Regulation 210-10, which required the strict separation of black and white troops in all facilities at all times on American soil and abroad. The Army's attitude toward black combat troops was shaped by a pseudo-scientific tradition of racial categorization that had infected military thinking since at least the Civil War. The Army War College's notorious 1925 study, The Use of Negro Manpower in War, concluded, with the confident racism of institutional authority, that the black soldier was inferior in intelligence, lacking in initiative, and unsuitable for modern combat. This document was not a fringe opinion. It was a policy document. It shaped assignments and promotion structures for black soldiers throughout the 1930s and into the early years of the Second World War. The consequence was predictable. The vast majority of the 1 million black men in uniform were assigned to service and support roles. They drove trucks, loaded ammunition, cooked food, built roads, operated supply depots. They performed, in other words, the logistics of war, the invisible work without which no fighting force can function while being formally denied the right to do the fighting itself. Not all of them accepted this arrangement. The pressure from black civilian organizations, from the black press, and from politically engaged African American communities forced the military establishment to make concessions it found deeply uncomfortable. Combat units were formed. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and the larger 332nd Fighter Group became the most famous of these, the unit whose performance in the air over North Africa and Italy would do more than any other to demolish the intellectual scaffolding of the 1925 War College study. But the Tuskegee Airmen were not alone. There were black artillery units, engineer battalions, and infantry regiments, and there was, activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana on the 1st of April 1942, the unit that would become the 761st Tank Battalion. Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, was not a hospitable place for black soldiers. The camp was in the heart of the segregated South. The facilities for black troops were inferior by design. The surrounding towns enforced the full apparatus of Jim Crow. Confrontations between black soldiers and white military police were common and frequently violent. The Army's response to racial incidents on military posts was almost invariably to discipline the black soldiers rather than address the conditions that produced the conflict. It was in this environment that the men who would become the Black Panthers learned to fight. They trained on M3 light tanks, then transitioned to the M4 Sherman medium tank, the workhorse of American armored warfare. The Sherman was not the best tank of the Second World War. It was outgunned by the German Panther and Tiger in direct combat, but it was reliable. It was available in enormous numbers, and in the hands of crews who knew it with the intimate familiarity that 2 years of constant training produced. It was a weapon of considerable effectiveness. The 761st spent more than 2 years in training. This was not unusual, but it was complicated by a persistent institutional uncertainty about whether or not the unit would ever be deployed. There were officers in the Army chain of command who actively lobbied to have the 761st converted from a combat unit to a service unit. The argument, predictable in its logic, was that black men could not be trusted to function effectively in the stress of armored combat. The argument was defeated, in part, by the performance of the Tuskegee Airmen, who had already demonstrated that it was wrong. It was defeated, in part, by the political pressure of the black press and civil rights organizations, and it was defeated, most practically, by the grinding attrition of the Normandy campaign, which had consumed American armored strength at a rate the Army had not anticipated. By the late summer of 1944, the Army needed tank crews. Politics or no politics, the 761st was going to war. The 761st arrived at the front with a white commanding officer, a circumstance that was itself a function of Army policy, which restricted black officers from commanding black units above a certain size. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates was a 34-year-old Californian, a former football coach and teacher who had come to command the 761st in early 1944. What distinguished Bates from the many white officers who viewed command of black troops as a professional liability was something more difficult to categorize than policy or procedure. It was, by all accounts of the men who served under him, a genuine respect for the soldiers in his charge. Sergeant Johnny Stevens, who served in Charlie Company, recalled in a 1977 oral history conducted by the 761st's historian that Bates was the kind of man who would fight for you, not because he had to, but because he thought you were worth fighting for. Bates fought for his men before they had fired a single shot in combat. When military police at Camp Claiborne began harassing and, in one documented case, beating black soldiers from the 761st, Bates confronted the post commander directly. When a Mississippi sheriff attempted to arrest a member of the battalion for an alleged traffic violation that was almost certainly pretextual, Bates interposed himself personally. These were not small acts. They were acts that cost an officer politically in an army whose culture rewarded compliance with the racial order rather than resistance to it. Into this context arrived, in October of 1944, the directive that the 761st would report to the 3rd United States Army, commanded by General George S. Patton. Patton's record on race was, to put it charitably, complex. He was the product of a Virginia family with Confederate roots. His private letters, portions of which were published posthumously, contain racist language that is ugly and unambiguous. He had made comments throughout his career that reflected the inherited assumptions of his class and generation about black intelligence and capacity. And yet, on November 2nd, 1944, Patton addressed the assembled men of the 761st at a base in France. The speech he gave has been reproduced in various forms, and there is documentary disagreement about the precise wording, but the substance is consistent across multiple accounts, including those of the men who were there. He told them he did not care about the color of their skin. He told them that he had asked for them and that he was glad to have them. He told them that some of them would die, and here he used language that was blunt even by Patton's standards, but that they would be dying for something that mattered, and that he expected them to make the enemy die for their country too. He reportedly said, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you." The men's reactions were, as one might expect from soldiers being asked to die, varied. Some found the speech stirring, some found it condescending, some found Patton himself absurd, a showman in cavalry boots, addressing men who had already survived more dehumanization than he could imagine. Private E.G. McConnell, who would later become one of the unit's most important oral historians, recalled that his first thought upon seeing Patton was, "So this is the man who's going to get us killed." 3 days after the speech, on November 5, 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion entered combat. If there is a single figure whose story crystallizes both the courage of the 761st and the injustice of what was done to its memory, it is Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of Tecumseh, Oklahoma. Rivers was 23 years old when the 761st went into combat in France. He was, by every account, official, journalistic, and personal, an extraordinary soldier, physically powerful, mechanically gifted, and possessed of what his tank commander Sergeant Samuel Turley described as a kind of calm you didn't find in most men, a calm that wasn't stupid. It knew exactly what was happening, and it just didn't care. On November 8, 1944, just 3 days into the battalion's combat service, Rivers' tank was struck by an anti-tank round near the town of Guebling, France. The explosion destroyed the tank's track and wounded Rivers severely in the leg. The wound was the kind that by standard procedure and by direct order from battalion medical officers should have resulted in evacuation. The wound exposed bone. The pain by any reasonable medical standard would have been debilitating. Rivers refused evacuation for the next several days, the precise timeline varying slightly between accounts but consistent in its essential structure. Rivers continued fighting. He fought with his leg wound wrapped and bleeding through bandages that had to be replaced regularly. He fought as the battalion drove into increasingly fierce German resistance around the Moselle River corridor, through terrain that armored doctrine described as difficult and that actual experience revealed to be brutal. On November 16, 1944, in the town of Guebling, during an action that the battalion's after-action reports describe as among the most intense of its early combat operations, Ruben Rivers died. He died in his tank, directing fire against a German anti-tank position that was suppressing the advance of other American armor. He died in the language of the citation that was written for him at the time, a citation that would not be acted upon for 53 years, in a manner far above and beyond the call of duty. The initial recommendation for Rivers to receive the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, was submitted through channels in late 1944 and early 1945. It was not approved. The precise administrative trail of what happened to that recommendation is itself a document of institutional racism. The paperwork moved through Army bureaucracy was evaluated by reviewing officers who may or may not have known the full circumstances and emerged without the medal attached to it. Rivers was awarded the Silver Star. The Silver Star is not a small honor, but it is not the Medal of Honor. And the distinction matters because the Medal of Honor carries with it not just recognition, but a specific, elevated place in national memory. It is the decoration that is remembered. It is the decoration whose recipients are named in school books and memorial speeches and presidential addresses. For 53 years, the name Ruben Rivers was not in those school books. He had died for a country that buried him twice, once in French soil and once in the sediment of official forgetfulness. By the time the German Wehrmacht launched its massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion had already been fighting continuously for over 6 weeks. They had helped break German defensive lines in the Moselle River sector. They had taken casualties. They had also, in the cold arithmetic of military effectiveness, demonstrated exactly what the Army War College's 1925 study had said they could not. They were capable soldiers. They were capable of more than capable. The Ardennes Offensive, what history records as the Battle of the Bulge, was the Wehrmacht's last major attempt to split the Allied advance and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was built around a massive armored thrust through terrain the Allies believed too difficult for large-scale armored operations aimed at capturing the key logistics hub of Antwerp. In its first days, it achieved a shocking degree of success. American units on the northern shoulder of the advance were overrun or encircled. The news reaching Allied headquarters was, for several terrifying days, genuinely alarming. The 761st was redeployed to meet the threat. Throughout December 1944 and January 1945, as the weather turned to the kind of cold that paralyzes machinery and kills men who lack adequate shelter, the Black Panthers fought as part of the Allied effort to reduce the German salient. They operated in conditions that tank crews who survived the war would describe, decades later, as the worst they encountered at any point in the European theater. The Ardennes in winter is a landscape of ice and frozen mud, of forested ridges where visibility closes to almost nothing and where a tank can slide off a road and become a steel coffin within seconds. In this environment, the 761st performed. The after-action reports, now declassified and available through the National Archives, are not heroic documents. They are technical and spare, written in the abbreviated language of military administration, but read carefully. They tell a story of a unit performing consistently under conditions of extreme stress, adapting to tactical situations with the kind of initiative that the 1925 War College study had predicted they would lack. One detail from the Ardennes operations has survived in the personal accounts of veterans with particular vividness. During the fighting around the town of Tilley in Belgium, a town that American forces would attempt and fail to take multiple times before finally securing it, the 761st's tanks operated in coordination with white infantry units who initially refused, in some documented cases, to work alongside black soldiers. The army was still segregated, the front lines were still segregated. The absurdity of maintaining segregation in conditions of active combat was made manifest in those frozen Belgian fields, where the question of which soldiers went forward together was decided finally by who was present and willing to fight, rather than by the racial taxonomy of army regulation. They took Tillet. The spring of 1945 carried the 761st eastward, into Germany itself, and then into Austria. By this point, the battalion had been in continuous combat for over 5 months, a run of operational tempo that would have strained any unit and that had tested the Black Panthers to the absolute limits of what men and machines can endure. What they encountered in the Austrian town of Gunskirchen in early May of 1945 was something for which no military training can prepare a soldier. The 761st was among the American units that arrived at the Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp network, shortly after its liberation. What they found there is documented in the accounts of the soldiers who were present, in the reports filed by attached army medical personnel, and in photographs that are among the most disturbing images produced by a war that generated an almost incomprehensible quantity of disturbing images. The camp held thousands of prisoners, the majority of them Hungarian Jews who had been forced marched from other camps as the Wehrmacht collapsed. The death toll in the final weeks had been catastrophic. The survivors, those who had lived long enough to see American vehicles on the road outside the wire, were, in the accounts of those who were there, barely recognizable as human beings. Private William McBurney, a member of the 761st, recalled this encounter in an interview conducted decades after the war. He was 20 years old when he drove his tank into the perimeter of the Gunskirchen camp. He said, "I couldn't understand how any human being could do this to another human being, and I kept thinking, these people, these Jewish people, they know what it is to be treated like they aren't human. They know what we know." This observation, made by a young black man from a country that had its own apparatus of dehumanization, encountering the furthest extreme of what happens when the logic of racial hierarchy is followed to its conclusion, is one of the most profound moral reflections to emerge from the entire American experience of the Second World War. It was not made in a book. It was not made in a policy document. It was made by a 20-year-old tanker standing in the mud of an Austrian death camp, and for decades almost nobody heard it. No account of the 761st Tank Battalion is complete without acknowledging the figure who briefly served with the unit before his history took him in a different direction. Jackie Robinson, the man who would, in 1947, break the color barrier in professional baseball and become one of the most celebrated figures in American history, was assigned to the 761st Tank Battalion as a second lieutenant in 1943 during the unit's training period at Camp Hood, Texas. He was a graduate of UCLA, a former multi-sport athlete, a man of evident intelligence and prickly dignity, who navigated the Army's racial apparatus with a combination of formal compliance and quiet resistance. In July of 1944, Robinson boarded an Army bus at Camp Hood, Texas, and sat beside the light-skinned wife of a fellow black officer. The bus driver ordered him to move to the back. Robinson refused. The incident escalated into a confrontation with military police, a formal charge of insubordination, and a court-martial. Robinson was ultimately acquitted of all charges. The case against him was thin and the proceedings were irregular enough that the reviewing officer declined to convict, but by the time the legal process concluded, the 761st had shipped out without him. Robinson never went to war. He was transferred to other duties and eventually discharged in November of 1944. His subsequent path to Abbotsfield and into the mythological center of American civil rights history is well known, but the nature of his confrontation at Camp Hood, Texas, the specific act of not moving to the back of the bus, resonates across time in ways that deserve attention. In 1955, Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, and that act of refusal would become one of the founding moments of the modern civil rights movement. Robinson's act in 1944 is almost structurally identical. It is not a footnote. It is in miniature the entire argument, the claim to dignity in the face of a system that has decided your dignity is negotiable, that it happened in the context of the 761st Tank Battalion, a unit built around the effort to prove, through combat, the full humanity of black soldiers, gives it a meaning that extends beyond Robinson's individual biography. When the 761st Tank Battalion received its orders to stand down in June of 1945, the unit's combat service record looked like this: 183 consecutive days in active combat, 7 major campaigns, 3 European countries, participation in the liberation of 2 Nazi concentration camps, an estimated 1,000 German soldiers killed, enemy armor and guns destroyed by the score, 526 casualties, including 71 killed in action. The battalion had been recommended for the Presidential Unit Citation, a unit-level decoration that is, in the hierarchy of American military honors, the equivalent of the Medal of Honor for an individual, by at least 2 of the generals under whom it had served, including a formal recommendation that passed through the 3rd Army command structure in early 1945. The recommendation was not approved. It was, as far as the documentary record permits a conclusion, set aside without formal denial, left in a bureaucratic limbo that is its own form of erasure. It would remain in that limbo for 33 years. When we ask why the story of the 761st Tank Battalion was buried, we are not asking a simple question. The burial was not the work of a single decision, a single official, a single policy. It was the cumulative product of dozens of smaller acts of omission and commission, each one individually deniable, collectively devastating. Consider the sequence. The citation recommendation is set aside, not formally denied. An administrative act, so passive it barely registers as a decision. The individual soldiers return home to a country where, in 12 states, they are legally prohibited from voting. The Army, which desegregated by executive order in 1948, under President Truman's Executive Order 9981, struggles for years afterward with the practical implementation of desegregation, during which the histories of segregated units tend to be absorbed into general unit histories that do not emphasize their racial composition. The official Army historical program, which produces multi-volume unit histories throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, does not produce a major history of the 761st, the men of the battalion scattered to civilian life. Most of them are working class men who return to working class circumstances, to jobs, families, the practical demands of survival in a country that continues legally and structurally to disadvantage them. They do not write memoirs. They do not have agents or publicists. The infrastructure that turns military experience into cultural capital, the speaking circuits, the book deals, the honorary degrees, is, like most of American social infrastructure at mid-century, largely inaccessible to black veterans. The histories that do get written in the immediate post-war period are histories of white units, white commanders, white experiences. They are not necessarily written with the deliberate intention of excluding black soldiers. They are written by people who have access to records, to survivors, to the institutional memory of units whose members remained in communication with each other through veterans' organizations that were themselves frequently segregated. The result is not a conspiracy. It is something more insidious, a structural outcome that requires no individual malice to produce its effects. The stories that get told are the stories of people with the social capital to tell them. The stories that go untold are the stories of people the society has systematically denied that capital. This is one of the central mechanisms by which historical memory is shaped. It is not primarily about lies. It is primarily about resources, about who has the time, the access, the platform, and the institutional support to transform lived experience into documented history. In 1977, a group of veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion, many of them now in their 50s and 60s, began actively lobbying for the presidential unit citation that had been recommended and never awarded. They had the support of several members of Congress, most notably Charles Rangel of New York, himself a decorated Korean War veteran who understood from personal experience what it meant for a black soldier's service to go unrecognized. The lobbying effort required, among other things, a reconstruction of the documentary record, finding the original citation recommendation, tracing its path through the bureaucratic maze of the post-war army, demonstrating that the failure to award it was not the result of a finding of merit, but of administrative omission. This was itself a kind of historical detective work, conducted by men who had not been trained as historians, but who understood that the truth they were pursuing mattered. On January 24, 1978, President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion in a ceremony at the White House. Carter's remarks at the ceremony were gracious and, within their limits, honest about the failure of recognition. He spoke of the debt owed to these men. He spoke of the injustice of the long delay. What he could not do, what no ceremony can do, was give back the 33 years. He could not give back the years during which the men who had died in France and Belgium and Germany had gone uncommemorated. He could not give back the years during which survivors had lived with the knowledge that their country considered their service not worth a formal acknowledgement. He could not give back the years during which the history of the 761st had been inaccessible to the children and grandchildren of the soldiers who might have known to be proud of it if anyone had thought to tell them. A presidential unit citation, 33 years late, is better than no presidential unit citation. It is also an object lesson in the inadequacy of delayed justice. The Presidential Unit Citation in 1978 did not exhaust the debt. The individual medals, particularly the Medal of Honor for Ruben Rivers, remained unawarded. In 1992, the United States Army commissioned a study conducted by Shaw University under the direction of Dr. Daniel Guebling to examine whether racism had affected the award of the Medal of Honor to black soldiers during World War II. The study was called The Buffalo Soldiers and the Medal of Honor. Its conclusion, documented through an examination of Army records, after-action reports, and the testimony of surviving veterans and their families, was unambiguous. Yes, racism had systematically prevented the award of the Medal of Honor to black soldiers who had earned it. The study identified 7 soldiers whose service records clearly warranted the Medal of Honor and who had been passed over. One of them was Ruben Rivers. On January 13, 1997, 53 years after his death in a Sherman tank in the mud of Guebling, France, Ruben Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. President Bill Clinton presided. Ruben Rivers' niece, Cora Carter, accepted the medal on behalf of her family. She was 73 years old. She had grown up knowing that her uncle had died in the war, knowing that he had fought bravely, knowing in the way that families know things without the official confirmation that he had done something exceptional. She had lived her entire adult life without the country's confirmation that this knowing was correct. In his remarks at the ceremony, Clinton said, "History has been made whole today." It was a phrase meant to be generous and inclusive. It is also looked at honestly, a phrase that reveals the limits of what official recognition can accomplish. History had not been made whole. History had been made more accurate. That is not the same thing. The wholeness, the years of life in which the knowledge of Ruben Rivers' valor might have meant something to the people who loved him and to the communities who shared his experience, that wholeness was gone. It had not been preserved, ready to be restored. It had been used up in the long, ordinary hours of days that passed without acknowledgement. There is a tendency, when we discuss the delayed recognition of historical injustices, to treat the moment of recognition as a kind of resolution. The arc of the moral universe, we are told, bends toward justice. The implication is that the bending, however slow, is sufficient, that the eventual arrival at truth justifies the journey. This framing is too comfortable. It asks the victims of injustice to absorb the costs of the delay without complaint, in confidence that the correction will eventually come. It treats time as a neutral medium through which justice travels, rather than as a resource that is itself distributed unequally. The men of the 761st who died between 1945 and 1997, the men who died without their country's acknowledgement of what they had done, did not experience the arc of the moral universe as a narrative of eventual triumph. They experienced it as a long silence. What does this forgetting cost? Beyond the individual suffering of the forgotten, it costs a shared understanding of what the country actually is. One of the most persistent myths of American national identity is the myth of universal inclusion, the story of a nation that has always been, if imperfectly, moving toward its stated ideals of equality and justice for all. This myth is both true and false simultaneously, and the way in which it manages to be both at once is through the selective inclusion of certain histories and the systematic exclusion of others. The story of the 761st if it were as widely known as the story of, say, the Easy Company of the 106th Parachute Infantry Regiment, made famous by the HBO series Band of Brothers, would complicate the national mythology in ways that are both uncomfortable and necessary. It would force a reckoning with the fact that the generation widely described as the greatest generation was also a generation in which the United States maintained an apartheid system within its own borders, drafted the people that system oppressed to fight in its wars, and then declined to honor them when they fought with distinction. This does not make the courage of the 761st smaller. It makes the irony larger. And irony on this scale, the irony of men fighting for freedoms they were legally denied, proving their humanity in a country that questioned it, is not merely ironic, it is morally instructive. The story of the 761st is not unique. It is, in the scholarship of African American military history, one of many. The Buffalo Soldiers of the post-Civil War era, who fought in campaigns across the American West and in Cuba, largely disappeared from popular histories until the late 20th century. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters of the First World War, who served longer in continuous combat than any other American unit, and whose regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre by France en masse, spent decades in relative historical obscurity. The Tuskegee Airmen themselves, whose story has now been told in films and documentaries and educational curricula, were for decades known primarily within black communities rather than in the broader American historical consciousness. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a system. What are its components? First, the documentation problem. The official record of segregated units was maintained within the Army's segregated administrative structure, and when that structure was dismantled after Truman's 1948 executive order, the records of segregated units were not systematically integrated into the master historical narrative. They remained in archives, technically accessible, practically invisible. Second, the survivor disparity. The ability of veterans to maintain unit cohesion after the war, to attend reunions, maintain contact, advocate collectively for recognition, was shaped by economic circumstance. White veterans of World War II benefited enormously from the GI Bill, which provided education, low-interest home loans, and business support. Black veterans were largely excluded from these benefits by a combination of formal discrimination and informal exclusion. Universities that wouldn't admit black students, lending institutions that wouldn't provide mortgages in neighborhoods where black families were permitted to live. The disparity in post-war economic circumstance translated into a disparity in the social infrastructure through which unit histories were preserved and transmitted. Third, the publishing and media ecosystem. The stories of World War II that reached popular audiences were mediated by publishers, editors, producers, and broadcasters who were operating in the same racially structured society that had produced the segregated army. The popular imagination of World War II was shaped by these mediators, and the shape it took reflected the priorities and blind spots of the people doing the shaping. These are not accusations of individual malice. They are descriptions of structural conditions. But structural conditions produce real outcomes for real people. And the outcome here was the near total exclusion of black military experience from the World War II story that America told itself for the better part of 3 decades. There is a question that haunts any serious engagement with stories like this one, and it is the question of what, if anything, historical recovery can accomplish. We can tell this story. We have told this story here, with the names and dates and the specific, irreducible details that anchor history in the real Ruben Rivers bleeding in his tank in Guebling, William McBurney standing at the wire of Gunskirchen, Cora Carter accepting a medal for her uncle 53 years after his death. We can add these details to the collective record. We can hope that the record, made more complete, shapes how people understand their country and themselves. But we cannot give back what was taken. We cannot give Rivers his medal when it would have meant something in the days and weeks after his death, when his mother was still alive and his friends were still present, and the community of Tecumseh, Oklahoma, still remembered him as a boy who grew into a soldier of remarkable courage. We cannot give back the 33 years between the end of the war and the Presidential Unit Citation, years during which the veterans of the 761st lived as men whose country had quietly decided their service was not worth commemorating. What we can do is refuse to let the refusal stand. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion did not end in 1945. It did not end with the Presidential Unit Citation in 1978. It did not end with the Medal of Honor ceremonies in 1997. It continues in the ongoing argument about what the American story is and who gets to be in it. Every time a curriculum committee decides which stories are essential and which are supplementary, the 761st is implicated. Every time a museum designs an exhibition about the Second World War and must decide whose photographs occupy the central panels, the 761st is implicated. Every time a filmmaker greenlights a project about the greatest generation and casts that generation as the unit histories that already exist on his shelf, the 761st is implicated. The mechanisms of historical memory are not neutral. They are operated by people making choices, and those choices reflect, however unconsciously, however structurally, the values and priorities of the institutions that employ those people. The fact that Band of Brothers, the 2001 HBO production based on Stephen Ambrose's book about Easy Company, remains the most watched and most culturally influential American treatment of World War II ground combat, while no comparable production has been made about the 761st. This is not an accident of the artistic marketplace. It is a data point about what the cultural institutions of early 21st century America consider worthy of being made vivid and available to mass audiences. This is not an argument that the men of Easy Company were not brave or that their story is not worth telling. It is an argument that the metric of worthiness has never been neutrally applied. It is important in ending this account to name the people who refused to let the story stay buried, not just historians and politicians, but the veterans themselves, who spent decades pursuing recognition for their comrades, e.g., McConnell, who served in the 761st as an enlisted tanker and who spent much of his post-war life as a tireless advocate for the unit's history, giving talks at schools and community events, and conducting oral history interviews long before oral history had become an established academic methodology. McConnell understood something that is easy to lose sight of in the abstractness of historical analysis: that the work of memory is not finished when the official recognition comes. It continues in the personal human transmission of specific stories, the specific detail, the specific name, the specific moment that makes a human being out of a category. William McBurney, who died in 2005, gave a series of interviews in his final years in which he returned again and again to what he had seen at Gunskirchen, to what that encounter had meant to him as a black man from a country that had its own version of the logic he saw enacted at its extreme in that Austrian camp. His testimony is preserved in the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Paul Bates, the commanding officer who fought for his men before they had fired a shot in combat, lived to see the Presidential Unit Citation awarded in 1978. He died in 1995, 2 years before Ruben Rivers received his Medal of Honor. He did not live to see the full official accounting of what his battalion had done, but he had known it for 50 years before the country did. The philosopher and educator W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk, described what he called the double consciousness of African American identity, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a society that does not see you as fully human. He called it a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Du Bois wrote those words 40 years before the 761st Tank Battalion was activated. They describe, with the precision of an instrument, the position of every man who served in it. These were men who understood exactly how the society around them perceived them. They chose, in the face of that understanding, to do something remarkable. They fought not only for the country that doubted them, but for the idea that the country was worth fighting for. Whether that idea was justified is a question that American history continues to negotiate. The long silence around the 761st is one form of the answer that history gave them. The story we tell now, incomplete, belatedly offered, inadequate in every way that matters most, is another form of the answer we are still trying to formulate. The men of the 761st did not need history to vindicate them. They knew what they had done. Ruben Rivers knew in the last hours of his life in a tank on a French plane that he had chosen something. The men who were with him knew it. The men who survived knew it and carried it for decades through a silence that the country mistook for forgetting. The country forgot. The men did not. What we owe them at this distance is not a sentiment. It is a correction of the record told with enough specificity and enough honesty that it cannot easily be set aside again. The Black Panthers of the 761st Tank Battalion served 183 days in combat. They fought across France, Belgium, and Austria. They helped liberate a Nazi death camp. They were recommended for the highest unit honor the United States military can award, and the recommendation was set aside for 33 years because of the color of the skin of the men who had earned it. That is the record, and now that you know it, it is part of yours.